I could have your attention, welcome. My name is Norm Goda. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Studies here at the University of Florida, and it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Rachel Gordon and our guest today, Stephen Prothero, who will talk about his book, God the Bestseller. I do want to say a couple of things. This event is sponsored by the Bud Shorstein Professorship in American Jewish Society and Culture. We have some refreshments after the presentation today, so I hope you will stick around. And also, I want to interest you, particularly if you are undergraduates, in our courses for the fall. I have a brochure here with all of the courses for the fall. I guarantee you, you will find courses that aren't taught anywhere else in the country in this. We have a course on film in Israel in 1948 that is fascinating. We have a course on Israel in French film. We have a course on Jew hatred. We have a number of other courses in here on all Jewish subjects, ranging from the Hebrew Bible to the Holocaust to the State of Israel, that you will find fascinating. We also offer a number of certificates. If you can't major in Jewish studies, that's fine. A certificate is a nice credential to have and relatively easy to get. So if you haven't picked up one of these, I will leave them on that table there, and I will turn things over to my colleague, Rachel Gordon.
Thank you. Welcome. Stephen Prothero is the C. Allen and Elizabeth V. Russell Professor of Religion in America in the Department of Religion at Boston University. He is the author of numerous books, including Religion Matters, an introduction to the world religions, Why Liberals Win the Culture Wars, God is Not One, and the New York Times bestseller, Religious Literacy, What Every American Needs to Know and Doesn't. I wanted to mention those because I thought many of you would have an interest in at least one of those. We're here today to talk about Professor Prothero's most recent book, God the Bestseller, How One Editor Transformed American Religion, a Book at a Time. And Steve, this is a book about a man named Eugene Exman, who I think most of us, or all of us, have never heard of. I'm curious if you had heard of him before this book, or when you discovered him.
No, I had never heard of him. And in fact, one of the things that so intrigued me about him when I first stumbled across him 5 minutes from my house on Cape Cod was precisely that. Here I am, somebody who's been teaching American religion for 25 years. Here's a guy who turns out to be the most influential producer of books in mid-20th century America. Many of those books had a huge influence on our field of religious studies, and somehow I had never heard of him until I stumbled across this archive.
Okay, so what was this archive that you stumbled across?
Yeah, so I got a call about 10 years ago from a woman named Judy Kess, and she, as I said, lived 5 minutes from my house. She knew my mother. They weren't exactly best buddies, but I was aware of who she was. And she said, my father left behind a lot of books. Would you come over, of religion books, would you come look at them? And I said, okay, sure, I'll come look at them. And I really wasn't particularly interested in going to look at these books because I have actually done this before for people who live in New England and they have a lot of religion books. They're just almost always a minister who has a lot of Bibles and a lot of hymnals and a lot of books of sermons, and they aren't valuable, they aren't that interesting to people in religious studies. So I wasn't really that motivated to go, but it was really because of my connection with my mom that I felt that I should call her back, so I did. I called her back, and she actually had become ill. She was dying of cancer, and so I didn't have an appointment right away, but after she had passed away, I went over to the house, and when I went in, I was sort of thinking, like, let's get this done in half an hour maybe, so I can go back to my work and fulfill my obligation. And so her husband, Walter Cass, led me into the library. And the first thing I noticed was that the books were not 19th century books. They were mostly mid-20th century books, mostly 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s books. And the very first book I pulled off the shelf was Stride Toward Freedom by Martin Luther King. It was his first book. It was about the Montgomery bus boycott. It really had a galvanizing effect on the civil rights movement. And I opened it up and I looked and I saw it was the first edition, which I thought was pretty cool. And then inside it I found a letter, and it was from Coretta Scott King, and it said, "Dear Gene, thank you so much for coming down to Montgomery to convince Martin to write his first book. You have had such a profound influence on the advance of brotherhood and Christian fellowship in the United States." And I'm like, whose house am I in? Who is this person? And then the second book I pulled off was the Big Book of AA, much earlier, 1939, instead of, King's book is from the 50s. And the Big Book of AA, you don't have to admit if you have seen this book or, haven't seen the book, but it's this large format book. And I opened that book up, and on one of the early facing pages, which was empty, was this long, long inscription. And again, it was Dear Gene. It was signed by Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA, the author, essentially, the anonymous author of the Big Book of AA. Dear Gene, thank you so much for looking at the first 3 chapters of the book and editing them. Thank you so much for your advice that we do not publish it with you, but we publish it ourselves because we're starting our own movement and we need to control our own scripture. And you were such an important person in the development of AA and never would have been the same without you. Those are the first 2 books I pull off the shelf.
So just to let folks know, AA, Alcoholics Anonymous,
Yeah.
And to give us an idea of how Exman thinks about religion differently, we might not all be thinking of Alcoholics Anonymous as a religion-y thing, but
Right.
Why was that up Exman's alley?
Right. So, the reason, and I didn't know this either before I wrote this book, but, the Big Book of AA is essentially conversion stories. It's stories about people who were drunks, that's their word, people who were and are drunks, who somehow figured out how to stop drinking. And in all the cases in the Big Book of AA, in every case, there is a spiritual experience or a religious experience that prompted them to get out of their willful behavior of their pride of thinking they could overcome their addiction to a crisis moment that's very much like a Christian conversion narrative, where I realized I was a sinner, I fell down before God, confessed my sins, and all of a sudden I felt the power of God. Those are what all those stories are. And in fact, in that book, there was a really important, I think, debate about whether those experiences were going to be called spiritual experiences or religious experiences. And one of the big themes in the book, as I was working on it, once this archive came into my possession, is this debate about where does religion end, where does spirituality begin? Is religion a good thing or a bad thing? Is organized religion this thing that needs to be overcome, which most of his writers and Exman himself believed, or is institutional religion really, a good thing, or is the good thing really the individual, personal spirituality? So just to jump back quickly to my discovery story of the books. Once I went through, found these books, and I kept finding papers inside them. I said to Walter, these books are really interesting, but do you have any papers? And he sort of tilted his head back and rolled his eyes, and he was like, oh my God, this family never threw anything away. And so as a scholar, a historian, you're like, ding, 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 that's what I want to hear. And so then over the course of the next year or year and a half, he would call me up every month, every couple of weeks, and he'd say, okay, I spent some time in the barn yesterday. I found 3 more boxes for you, come over. And I'd come over and he'd set up this sort of, office for me in his house in the dining room, and he would pop down the boxes and I would open them up, and they would be, letters between him and, Abram Heschel, or him and Martin Buber, or him and, Coretta Scott King, or, all these, Aldous Huxley, whom he published, the author of A Brave New World. There's maybe 100 unseen letters from Aldous Huxley in this collection. So it was really, really exciting for me to be able to go through and try to tell his story and see how it told also the story of 20th century American religion and the story of some of his most famous authors.
Mm. So you mentioned how the conversion story really resonates with him. Is that because he grew up with that idea of religion, or why is he attracted to stories about that?
Yeah, so he grew up, he was born in 1900, and so he like literally tracks the 20th century in his life until he dies in 1975. And he was born in rural Ohio. He was a farm boy. He worked on the farm. He went to a fundamentalist Baptist church. He was very active in that, in the Baptist church. The story of his life that I opened the book with is an odd experience he had as a 16 or a 17-year-old kid. He was going to a Bible study at night after dinner. He was riding his horse from his home into the town of Blanchester, Ohio, and they were passing the graveyard, and right as they were passing the graveyard, the horse just stopped and kind of reared back and whinnied like, woo! It sounded a little different from that, but you get the idea. And he looks up and he sees this bright flash of light. He feels electricity like running through his body. He feels himself pulled up and out of his body, and he says he sees God. And then the horse sort of like looks around, and he looks around, and then a few more beats, and the horse kind of clumps, along to the church, and he kind of clumps along into the rest of his life. And this was a transformative, wasn't really a conversion experience for him, but he had never had the kind of classic Baptist, go up and the altar call and feel your heart change and all that. That had never happened to him, but this was a kind of a substitute for him. And he said, he wrote about it a lot of times later in his archive, and he said, from that moment I knew I would never doubt God again. And what that moment did for him is it led him to just seek out people who had had experiences like this so that they could have conversations like, what the heck happened? What's your theory about it? How can we see God again? Because he and his friends all believed the world was in crisis, especially once they got to the 1940s and World War II. Materialism, militarism were just taking over the world, and that God was the answer to that problem. And in order to have people be motivated by God to respond to that problem, they needed to have direct experiences of God. And so these people who had these experiences, they became his friends, and then he would say to them, write a book for me, and they would say, okay, and so then they became his authors. And then he just assembled this amazing collection of, best-selling and non-best-selling books that were basically written by mystics who had a social conscience, who were almost always pacifists, and were sort of in this collective project together of speaking about the importance of religion to a world that had kind of lost its way.
So in a way, he was kind of converted to the idea of religion as experience, as you write, as opposed to dogma, and that this was then an idea that he helped, put out into the world through the authors and books he chose to publish. And that led him to these relationships with a bunch of different writers, as each chapter of your book describes. Many of those names were very well known in their day, but I think kind of lost today. For instance, Dorothy Day's story, in the book you describe her, or someone else had described her as the first hippie. I think this is someone that most of my students have never heard of, but maybe you can tell us a bit about her and why Exman was attracted, although attracted it sort of intellectually or by her experience, but as you write, they were never really close. So I'd love to hear what drew him.
So Dorothy Day was a Catholic. She grew up in a secular home. She, by her own account, in her two autobiographies that Exman publishes for Harper, she describes herself as someone who was always kind of drawn to religion, and friends would show up in her life and like give her a rosary or take her to an Episcopal church or take her to a Methodist church, and sort of kept alive this kind of God awareness in her. But then once she moves into her teens and 20s, she becomes a really secular person. She's really active in the kind of Greenwich Village anarchist lefty scene in New York City in the 20s, and she writes an autobiography then about her kind of crazy life that she had. But then she just kind of makes this, multi-step move into Catholicism. And I think for her, she became really interested in helping the poor, and she read about Catholic social teachings, but the main thing she read about was about women Catholic mystics who had this incredibly close connection with God that led them to a close connection with the poor and the outcast. And so she starts the Catholic Worker Movement, and she starts the paper called The Catholic Worker, for which she wrote and which she edited, and she establishes these communities that are called houses of hospitality, where anybody who was poor could come and stay, and they were just incredibly chaotic places because there was no vetting. There was no like, we don't allow drunks here. If you get in a fight, you're kicked out. There was none of that. Like, you could be a drunk, you could get in a fight, you could stay. You could be anti-Semitic, you could be racist. Like, these were kind of wild places, and Dorothy Day was keep the people there who were more practical than she would keep saying, like, we can't just let everybody in. And she was like, no, the whole point is that everybody, no matter how crazy they are or how, problematic they are, can be let in. So she actually gets to know Mr. Exman because she finds this piece of land on Staten Island that she just falls in love with, and she really wants to be able to establish a kind of a farm commune on that land, and the price was $10,000 and she needed 1,000. And she had this book idea, and she knew of Exman through some retreats that she had gone to where she had met him. And so she just marches into his office one day and says, I have this book idea, I want to write, my autobiography. And she describes it to him, and she says, I need $1,000 for the book. And he says, okay, you can write a book with us. And one of the things in the chapter about her that I found really interesting was the ways in which people around Exman at his publishing house, they were all Protestants mostly liberal Protestants. And they just found Catholicism sort of uncomfortable in some ways. And they found the kind of devotionalism to the saints uncomfortable. They found, they found this, like what they thought of as the superstition uncomfortable. The fact that they really believed like the body and the body and blood of Christ were somehow magically transformed in the Mass into, the bread and the wine were magically transformed into the body and blood of Christ. And this one woman who I read about in the book, Marguerite Brough, who was a close friend of Exman and one of his main editors, she read a manuscript by Dorothy Day, and her book review of it, her in-house book review, which among the things that I found is like the treasure trove of stuff in here is amazing, like manuscripts, reviews of the manuscripts, letters, in some cases hundreds of letters between the authors and Exman. So you can really see how these books are put together. In one of those, Marguerite Brough, who's reading this Dorothy Day manuscript, she says, this is a horrific book. I know you're going to publish it, but it's masochistic. It's like primitive, pre-modern, like why are we, and we here is like we enlightened Protestant people, why are we publishing this kind of horrible stuff? Let them publish it, and the them here is, Catholics. Let those Catholics publish it. And there's a really funny line she has in another book that she's working on where she exhorts the Catholic author, not Dorothy Day in this case, but a different Catholic author, do you really have to pray, in your autobiography, do you really have to pray to the baby Jesus? Like, Protestants don't pray to the baby Jesus. And so the book's going to sell better with Protestants if you don't pray to the baby. I would never tell you how to pray. You can pray however you want, but in the book you just might not want to pray to them. And no offense, but like we're trying to sell books to Protestants here too, and not just, and this is a big thing for Exman, and one reason for his success was he didn't want to publish Lutheran books that were sold to Lutherans, and Episcopal books sold to Episcopalians, and Jewish books sold to Jewish readers, and he wanted to publish books where people would talk kind of sufficiently generically about religion in order that they could sell and be distributed really broadly. So that was the kind of tension between a sort of incipient anti-Catholicism in his publishing house and this really important Catholic writer that they brought on.
Yeah, it reminds me, I think early in the book you describe Exman as a brilliant popularizer. And it's a term that I think many of our academic colleagues might sort of sneer at, just because if you're popularizing, that's already a little suspect among some academics. Yeah. Since in my own work, I also look at a lot of middlebrow literature, so this is of interest to me too. But, I guess the story you just told shed some light on how that popularizing could sometimes potentially do harm. It sounds like especially to Catholicism. The irony is that in the book, it seems like you point out this anti-Catholicism that seems to run through, but there's a lot of tolerance for other traditions, maybe especially non-white traditions. If you're Christian, or if you're Judeo-Christian, you're supposed to sort of stay within certain boundaries. But it seemed like Exman was interested in really different kinds of traditions too.
Yeah.
Maybe you could tell us a bit about that pluralism that he seemed to be advocating.
So one of the things, thanks for that question. One of the things that I found really interesting as a religious studies person is how from the very beginning Exman was trying to think of religion in more generic terms. So I mentioned like the publishing, when he came into religion publishing, it really was Lutherans writing for Lutherans and selling them in Lutheran bookstores, and Baptists writing for Baptists and selling them in Baptist bookstores, and Catholics and Jews doing the same, like to their own, writing for their own people. And so there wasn't an opportunity for any religion books to really become national conversation books because they were always slotted into a very narrow niche. So this is kind of like business 101, like sell to every American instead of to like Americans who are 5'3", who are left-handed, who might, like, why do that? Like write books to everyone. So he was always trying to figure out like how to do that and how to get, because religion is specific, right? No one's like just religious, right? You're Jewish or you're Baptist or you're something, right? At least institutionally, that's how religion operates through most of human history. So his magic trick was to get people who had really interesting things to say that they were saying in their sermons to their to Baptists, and get them to talk about what is it to be human, what is it to have a fulfilled life, and to write that way to a broader audience. So in that project, one of the most interesting things for me is when he kind of shifts out from Protestantism, Protestant and Catholic writers into like Hindu writers, Buddhist writers, Jewish writers, and one of the real moments for that was in the 40s. In 1941, he establishes this commune in Southern California. Like, he's from New York. By this time he's moved from, rural Ohio to New York. But he has become friends with Aldous Huxley, Brave New World author, who in the mid-40s publishes Perennial Philosophy, which makes this argument that all religions are different paths up the same mountain. We call this perennialism. That the religions are different, but only in essentials. In the essentials, the religions are basically the same, so there's no reason to fight about religion. Just join up in any religion and you'll connect with the reality that underlines them all. So he goes out to Southern California and he helps to establish this commune, which weirdly, there were a bunch of weird synchronicity things that were happening to me when I was writing the book. One of them is I had been to that commune because it eventually gets taken over by Vedantist Hindus, and it's outside of LA, and I had been there like 25 years ago when I was working on another book project. And I was reading about this in his papers, and I was like, I've been there. But anyway, that was like an interfaith, the books in the library that he got were books especially about Hindus, but also about Buddhists, All the world religions were represented there. And what they were all doing there was trying to come up with contemplative practices like meditative strategies mostly, and strategies of silence in community that would help people see God, that would help produce like some kind of mystical encounter with God. And so there, they were really influenced by the Hindus that were followers of this guy, Swami Vivekananda, who came to the United States in 1893, World's Parliament of Religion, and established the first Hindu groups in America, and those were called Vedanta societies. And they're swamis from India in LA at that time, and they were very much in conversation with Huxley and Exman and other people around this community. And so through that, he made connections with Hindu. There's people over there, including my brother. Hi. And my nephew. Hi. So he made connections with these Hindus, and he started publishing mostly translations, like translations of Hindu scriptures like Bhagavad Gita and stuff like that. But he was also publishing other books a lot of books by Hindus in the mid-40s. And then he's publishing D.T. Suzuki, the Zen scholar, very influential in New York. He's the one who kind of introduced the beat poets, Jack Kerouac and Ginsberg and stuff, to Zen and to Buddhism. So you see in the 40s, you see him, when the country is kind of broadening into like what some people have called this like tri-faith, that is in your book, the Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism. He's like ahead of the game. He's broadening it by that point beyond those three traditions to, what we now call Asian religion. He's publishing Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, etc. So this kind of shift from the Protestant preoccupation to pluralism is really interesting, and it's happening even as every single Sunday he's going to Riverside Church in Manhattan, as a like good dutiful Protestant guy, But his actual interests really aren't even so Christian as he develops. They become really focused more on God and on religion rather than on Jesus and Christianity.
Yeah, about Riverside Church, so there's another figure there. This is another big name that I feel like many of us today have not heard of. Who was the minister there that I think really attracted him to that church?
Yeah. So the third book that I pulled off the shelf that first day I went was a book by Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was the most famous 20th century minister in the United States until Billy Graham and Martin Luther King. So, and I would say those three are still, of the whole 20th century, are the most famous people. Harry Emerson Fosdick, by the time Exman moved to New York to take his job in 1928 for Harper, he came with a letter from his minister sending him to meet Harry Emerson Fosdick. Like, you should join his church, you should meet. So we had this, like, it's so old-fashioned now, now we send emails and stuff like that, texts. Emails, gosh, that's so old, but texts maybe. He arrives with this, printed letter signed, by Shaler Matthews, who's the dean of the University of Chicago, where Exman went as a graduate student. And like, here's a good boy, like, take him into you. And so the third book I took off the shelf was by him, by Harry Emerson Fosdick, and inside that there were, I think, 5 different letters. One was a letter about, man, I can't believe our book has sold 350,000 copies in the first month. That's pretty good, right? And then there was a Christmas card from his house in Maine of him and his wife in front of this like beautiful like wooden boat that they had. And anyway, and Harry Emerson Fosdick is really important in American religious history, probably most known for his intervention in the battle between more liberal and more fundamentalist Christians that happens in the 20s. And he writes, he gives a sermon called "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" And his answer is no. And it's happening at the time that fundamentalism, conservative Protestant Christianity is really taking off in the 20s, and he's the sort of like, let's allow there to be a Christian left in America and not just a Christian right in America. He's in the vanguard of the Christian left, and he gets lured by John Rockefeller Jr., of the Rockefeller magnate, billion-dollar Rockefellers. He gets lured by Rockefeller to join this church that is going to be built in in the like Upper West Side of Manhattan that is now the Riverside Church, like 16 stories high or something, all these buildings, like sort of one of the first mega churches in America. And he comes to that church, and that becomes the sort of center of liberal Protestantism in America. That's where Martin Luther King delivers a sermon where he really declares his move into anti-war, anti-poverty efforts, and not just the civil rights movement. So yeah, that's Harry Emerson Fosdick. He publishes over a dozen best-selling books with Exman that are addressed to broad audiences.
And then the connection to King, how does Martin Luther King Jr., how does that happen for Exman?
Yeah, so this to me is one of the most amazing stories of the book. So Martin Luther King, when he goes, first of all, I mean, he does a degree at my university, Boston University, so he has all these papers there, including all these book manuscripts that I was able to go into the archives and see where my guy, Mr. Exman, marked them up because I know his handwriting and I could see exactly what contributions he made to those books, which no one else has ever discovered, because no one ever knew his handwriting and knew to find those books. So, so when the Montgomery bus boycott is happening, and this is it's like in the mid-50s, there's all this discussion of the Montgomery bus boycott, and the Supreme Court hands down this ruling that basically says, you know, the protesters win. You know, you don't have, if you're black, you can't be forced to the back of the bus. Segregation of the bus services in Montgomery, Alabama is unconstitutional. And right when that gets handed down, there's this like flurry of interest in a book by Martin Luther King, who, by the way, is 28 years old at the time the Montgomery bus boycott is settled, and he's like 26 or something when he starts to become the lead. He's like just out of graduate school, goes down to Montgomery, he takes this job at this kind of unknown church in Montgomery, Alabama, and this protest starts, and they look around for like, who's going to lead this thing, and they're like, well, here's this kid, like, he doesn't, we're all too busy, let's get this young minister to like be in charge of the Montgomery bus boycott. And King is up for the task. He gives these amazing speeches that are so inspiring for so many people. And so all these editors are writing to Martin Luther King, and those are in the archives at Boston University. And he just keeps writing nice letters back to the editors. Thank you so much for your interest. I'm kind of busy right now, you know. I'm getting like death threats every day, like running the civil rights movement, you know, one of the people running the civil rights movement. I'm kind of busy to like be able to sit down and write a book, but I will keep you in mind. And then Exman decides to just go down to Montgomery. Like no editor went down there. And he had done this also with Howard Thurman, who's another really important civil rights figure. Exman publishes over a dozen books with Howard Thurman. And Thurman becomes a very close friend of his, of Exman's. And Exman goes and sees Thurman in the 30s, and he says, I want a book from you. And Thurman says, okay, but it takes 10 years. And Howard Thurman finally in the 40s does his first book with Exman, and then he just keeps publishing a bunch of other books. He also has a BU connection to my university because he becomes the chaplain. Howard Thurman becomes chaplain at Boston University, and he and King are friends. They're one generation apart. Thurman is older, and he's sort of giving paternal advice during the civil rights movement to Martin Luther King. But anyway, Exman goes down to Montgomery, and he knocks on King's door, and he says, you know, hi, you know, you should write a book for me. And he sits down, talks with King and with Coretta Scott King, and he leaves the meeting, and Martin Luther King has promised to write his first book. And so then there's this flurry of, we got to get this book out fast. This is a big story. You know, we don't want the story to go away. And this wonderful letters I have of the negotiations for writing that book. And one of in the scholarship, and the book, it's not really about arguing with scholars for the most part, my book, but there's a lot of scholarly literature in the civil rights movement about how important was King, and then also where does King get his ideas? And some people say he gets his ideas from white theologians he read at Boston University, Some people say, no, that's racist to think that he got all his ideas from white theologians at Boston University. He got his ideas from his dad, who was a black preacher, and from Ebenezer Baptist Church, where he went as a kid, and from other black intellectuals who influenced his father and influenced him. Where's the influence? And then similarly, there's a debate about his books. Like, if you want to find Martin Luther King, do you really find him in his books? And a lot of people say, no, those were edited by white people in New York. Like, why do we think that's Martin Luther King's voice? And so I was able to, in the book, to try to make an intervention there in talking about the negotiations around ghostwriters. Martin Luther King's agent wanted to hire a white ghostwriter in New York to write the book for him. And King was like, no, we're not doing a ghostwriter. We're not doing a white guy from Manhattan. And he said, I'm going to work on the book with this guy, Lawrence Reddick, who was from Montgomery, who knew everybody involved in Montgomery bus boycott. He was an older gentleman. He was a professor, a history professor. King insisted on him. And then I was able to piece together like how the book was written and how King would, in his longhand, would write out, often in a red pen, he would write out these chapters, and then they would be sent to New York, and then the editors would work on them, and then it would be typed up, and then there would be this meeting of all these people in New York who would send feedback back to King. So it was really interesting to me to see how King was really, even as a 20-year-old, was really like producing his own book. It was being edited. It was a collaborative project, like all books are. So he ends up writing his first 3 books. Martin Luther King ends up writing his first 3 books with Exman.
Yeah. We've been talking a bit about Exman's interests and the people he, chose to publish. I'm curious, in your research, did you find evidence, letters, correspondence about how these books, these ideas about religion, were in fact influencing Americans? Did you feel like there was any proof that, okay, Exman's ideas about religion reached people, might have shifted their own thinking on the topic?
Yeah. No. Like, that's the short answer.
Yeah.
Like, you want to say, like, well, yeah, and I do say, and I do believe, that he had a massive influence on 20th century American religion. And I think I would say on contemporary American religion, I would say, what are the most salient features of religion in the United States today? Well, one thing is the rise of white Christian nationalism that we saw on January 6th, right? That's a really salient contemporary feature that historians are going to have to figure out, like, how the heck did that happen? When did that start? Like, all that kind of stuff. But then there's the counterpoint to that, which is the pluralism, right? Like America is for white Christians. That's the white Christian nationalism thing. And then the other main voice now is, no, America is for people of all races and all religions. And the genius of America is not that it was founded as a Christian nation. The genius of America is that it was founded on secular principles where people of all religions were to be welcomed, right? So in that conversation over here, there's a question then of like, well, what is religion? And Exman said, as you alluded earlier, Exman said, religion is about experience. It's not about belief. It's not about creed. It's not about going to mass. It's not about ritual. It's about personal experience of the divine. And in that, where does he get that? He gets that from William James, whom we haven't discussed yet, who's a very important figure in religious studies. Varieties of Religious Experience, 1903. How do you define religion? He says, religion is about the feelings and experiences of individual people as they encounter the thing they think is God. Like, he doesn't presume there is any God. But that's what religion is about. And Exman, in terms of popularizer, as I interpret him, and there's a lot of information about James in the archive, Exman's preoccupation with James, Exman's love of the thinking of James, William James. Exman is popularizing that idea. Religion is personal. Religion is about experience. The highest experience is mystical experience. And once you have a mystical experience, you become a citizen who wants to make the world a better place by combating militarism and combating the malaise of modern materialism, I call it. That's the core of his thing, and he gets that from William James. So in the book, I kind of track the way James makes his way into Exman's brain. Exman starts publishing hundreds of books that are doing some version of this. Religion is not about killing other people who have the other false religion. In other words, religion is pluralistic. Religion is perennialist in the sense that all religions are essentially, the same. And so he's pushing that out into the world, and I would argue that this idea that religion is experiential is very widespread in America today. And I would say the idea that life is experiential is really, what I call the cultural of experience is very widespread in America today. Where does it come from? I would say this is where we can get super religion nerdy. It comes from revivals of the 1700s and 1800s where people have these powerful experiences of God. It comes from the transcendentalists who say, like Emerson and Thoreau, who say religion is internal, it's inside every person, and you are more likely to find it in nature than you were to find it in a church. It comes from that. But it kind of really gets synthesized by James, and then Exman publishes all these books that are basically doing the same thing as William James. And so, no, I have no smoking gun. I have no letter that says, I figured out religion was experiential when I read, your biography of Dorothy Day, or when I read the autobiography of Fosdick, or something like that. So it's really more me saying, it's kind of a more history of ideas argument that you can track how these ideas make their way into the culture, and you can see what the culture looks like now, and then you can say, if you put Exman in there, it's a compelling story and argument that he's a key figure. He's a key conduit for this stuff getting popularized.
Yeah, as you're talking about, the roots of this experience idea, or religion as experience, as in the book, as you give the story of Exman's life, it feels like it also comes from having been not quite satisfied with the organized religion of your childhood, or having felt like that didn't quite do it for me. I didn't really reach what I was supposedly supposed to reach in the church, or and so then it looks all the more attractive when you're reading James, and he's railing against big religion and rooting for the underdog, because when you're an Exman type who hasn't lived up to what the church expected, that feels like maybe that's speaking to you, or you still belong in that world.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's complicated because, and this is what I liked about working on his life, that when I first was learning about him from reading through his archives, I was sort of thinking this guy's not that interesting. He's just publishing interesting people. And then the more I read about him, I just kind of loved him. He's a 16-year-old kid who has this crazy experience. And he becomes obsessed with it, in the way that young people can just become obsessed with some fascinating thing, And so he's, he's doing that, I'm losing the thread of your question, though, because I had such a brilliant response to it. Can you just say it one more time?
Yeah, it was just about that, as you give us his biography, it seems clear that he wasn't really satisfied, which is something that many people here could probably relate to. The church didn't totally do it for them.
Thank you. Yeah, so he's a church kid growing up, and then he has this experience, and he's like, that's the real thing. That's the real thing that happened to me in front of the graveyard. And the thing at the church, a half a mile away, the Bible study I also went to, that's not the real thing. That's people jabbering about the real thing. And so he's always, the intriguing part for me about him, and that's the segue I got into, is why he intrigues me, but the intriguing thing for me about him is that he stays in the church his whole life. He's going to, every Sunday, he saves the bulletins from the church. I have seen them. There are piles and piles of every Sunday. He's going to Riverside Church. So he's doing that. But then he says, I'm on the board of directors of Riverside Church. I'm also on the board of directors of Harper Brothers. He's like, there's no difference between those two meetings. The Riverside Church meetings are not religious. There's no religion happening there. They're just talking about budgets and who they're going to hire, and, and similarly, he felt when he went to church, God wasn't there. It was people who were somehow curious maybe about God or something, but God wasn't there. God was in the private moments of meditation that he would do. God was in the 12-person Monday night group that he met with for over 20 years in Manhattan, where people would have a meal, sit in silence, and then talk about a book for 3 hours. Something happened there. Something happened at his commune in Southern California where they would sit for 3 hours at a time in a totally dark room where you couldn't see anything, and they would sit in silence and community together. Like, something happened there. But no, nothing's happening in church. It's like, it's too far away, you know? And so that's the experiential thing. And I think it's like thoroughly American, you know, the important and thoroughly modern, the importance of the individual, what is it? The hubris that, like, God is talking to you personally, like God is insufficiently busy, you know, to, you know, be able to, you know, talk to you, like that thing that you in this certain way can be at the center of the universe at some moment. And then also the humility that thing slips away. Like, it doesn't keep happening. You know, I was really taken by him in writing the book at the end of the book about, you know, he never sees, is this a spoiler alert? I don't know. Like, he never really has another experience of God. All he has is this kind of echo, the fainter and fainter echo of that experience he had. And yet, that just keeps motivating him. And so his conviction that religion is about experience is itself an experiential conviction. You know, we were talking about our friend Jeffrey Kripal. You know, he has the same, in religious studies, he has the same idea. You know, religion is about experience. Well, why? Well, because I've had this experience. You know, I've had this experience of God. And so in that sense, that's where I find him really fascinating. Why the heck is he going to church? And he is. And I think one answer could be, you know, the social. A lot of people go to church for social. But I don't think it was just that. I think he really felt there was an obligation to keep these institutions running because they provided a voice against the government, against the military, for what was good and just. They kept alive the memory that Christianity began with experiences, with mystical experiences. But it was such a distant echo that really you had to do the real thing in another room, like in another space.
When we were talking before this event, you were mentioning there was a lot more research than you were able to fit in the book, including with Exman's experience with Jewish authors. Just curious, did the Holocaust seem to play into any of his interest in these Jewish writers?
Yeah, you know, that's one thing that's really odd about the archive is how little that played into what he was doing. He was publishing Jewish authors pretty early. He was publishing Jewish authors in the 30s. There was an anthology of religious autobiography, which is a classic thing. Like, it wasn't Jewish autobiography. It wasn't Christian. It was religious. And it was, I'm forgetting the name of the gentleman. He was a rabbi at...
Was this the Louis Finkelstein
Yes,
one?
thank you. Rabbi at Jewish Theological Seminary. And he edited this book, and he published books by, you know, Finkelstein. And then there's a really interesting turn that I don't write about in the book, where in the 50s, he starts to publish paperbacks. And I didn't know this until I had this really great informant named Hugh Van Duzen who worked with Exman. He's now like 88 or something. He just retired from Harper 2 or 3 years ago in his mid-80s. He's still sharp as a tack. And I would call him and he would pick up the phone and just talk with me for 2 hours. And he would say, like, I don't know anything about any of this. And I would keep asking questions and he would always know great stuff about it. But he was there at the founding of this thing called Harper Torch Books, which was established in the mid-50s. And they published paperback books. I didn't know this, but paperback books are a 1950s invention. There were always paperback books in drugstores on little, you know, turning wheel things, and you could get a paperback novel or something like that. But in nonfiction, in like serious books, they didn't go into paperback. And they had this innovation at Harper that Exman initiated, that they would publish, you know, high quality paperbacks. Like, and that meant like all the other ones were low quality supposedly. But so these were like books by intellectuals, and a lot of them were books that you and I read, you know, when we were in graduate school, like of you know, I don't know, like people like Mircea Eliade, who's really, really popular, important figure in the 60s and 70s in religious studies. You know, those books were published by Exman in these paperback versions that were still being published when I was in grad school in the 1980s, I guess. I was in graduate school. And he published like Martin Buber, he published Heschel, Abram Heschel, who both Heschel is a rabbi, and Heschel is very important in the civil rights movement. When you see photographs of the rabbi marching with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement, that's Abram Heschel. And he published this beautiful and important book on the Sabbath, beautiful and important book on the prophets. I know the prophets book was published by Exman and Torch book. I can't remember if this Shabbat, this Sabbath book was published there too. But so he published those books. When the Torch books came out, he knew these were important authors. He brought those books into Harper, and he was friends with Finkelstein, but he wasn't really publishing books about the Holocaust. Like the books, like the big books, then were published elsewhere, and I don't really know if he. I don't know if he was. I mean, he was a pacifist in World War II. So, and he was a pacifist in the 20s, and the 30s, and the 40s, and the 50s, and the 60s, until he died. He was a pacifist. But he was a pacifist in World War II. So I don't know if he felt if he felt guilty, like that he, I don't know. I don't have any letters from him about like specifically about the Holocaust. It was about the horrors of World War II. Like he would write about the horrors of World War II. And it really wasn't clear that was it. So I don't know, this is the first time I'm thinking about this, but it could be his pacifism that meant that he wasn't publishing about the Holocaust, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it really would have been up his alley. I mean, he was anti-war, and he was against militarism and the power of government to kill. But he doesn't do it. But he does begin to publish Jewish authors as early as the 30s, and then he's publishing these really big names, like Heschel and Buber would be like top 5 names in the 20th century American Jewish writers.
Yeah, well, I want to open this up for your thoughts and questions for Stephen Prothero. So if people, have anything they want to ask, we'd love to hear from you. I guess one thing I was also wondering was how much of this was sort of a New York story, even his willingness and interest to go to these different kinds of traditions, that cosmopolitanism. It seems like it just felt normal for folks in the literary and publishing world, even in the first half of the 20th century, to kind of go beyond your own religious community.
I think I love that idea, and I think there's definitely something to that because, New York was the most cosmopolitan place to be in the United States in the mid-20th century, maybe still today. But I actually think it was LA for him. It was going out, meeting with Huxley's good friend Gerald Hurd, who was a very close friend of Exman, who was also publishing on Hinduism. I think it was there. He met Jiddu Krishnamurti, whom he published, who was this Indian kid who was tapped to be like the next Messiah by Theosophists in South India, and decided he didn't want to be God. There's a great line in a book that talks about Krishnamurti as, you got to give him credit. He's like one of the first people who was asked to be God and declined, So I think it was talking with Krishnamurti and with Huxley and with Hurd and with these Hindu swamis in Southern California that he really, that pushed him. But I also think it was the mysticism. If you believe you have an encounter with God, and then you start reading about other encounters, other mystical encounters with God, the focus is on that encounter, and it starts to downplay the focus on what language people use in a secondhand way to describe it, whether they use Jewish language or Christian language or Hindu language. I think it has a sort of decentering effect, that preoccupation with the mystical. So I would locate it more in his own autobiography in that moment, and then I would locate it more in Southern California, where the Hindu stuff is okay. Now I'm publishing Hindus. Well, then I should also probably publish Buddhists, and I should also probably publish, Muslims. That said, he's running into Finkelstein like on the streets while he's coming out of Riverside Church, right? So.
Right, and this is still at a time when many Americans have never met an actual Jew, and
Yes.
yeah, so that.
Yes,
that
that's
kind of
right, and that's
interaction.
certainly true. That's certainly true in terms of his encounter with Judaism. He's not going to encounter any Jewish people in Blanchester, Ohio, when he's growing up. Like that's not happening. Yeah.
Yes, Patsy.
I have a question. What happened with all those boxes that you were looking at?
Oh, what happened with the archive?
Which archive?
Yeah.
And did you arrange them or did you?
Right. So the first thing that happened then is they came into my house. So I was first working with them at his house. Then he got tired of me, and he said, just take them to your house. So I had all the archives in my house, and I loved that. Like, when do you have this amazing archive? It's like you go into some amazing library and you find a great archive, and you're like, do you mind if I bring this home? And they're like, sure, just take it home, write a book, bring it back sometime. Like, so that happened to me, I had it in my house. But it also made me really nervous, because you always think about your house, not always, but like, when you pay for your insurance every year, you think about your house burning down. And so I was thinking, I don't really mind if my house burns down, but I really don't want all these papers to burn down. And there's so many things in there. There's a letter from Bobby Kennedy in there. There's letters from all these hugely important business leaders, all these presidents of universities, and there's a letter from Kurt Vonnegut, who was the novelist, who was a neighbor and friend of Exman. So it's just really cool stuff. There's dozens and dozens of letters from someone we haven't mentioned, Albert Schweitzer, who was a Bible scholar, an amazing organist who leaves Europe and goes to West Africa he becomes a medical doctor to start this hospital, and he wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952. Exman published 2 Nobel Peace Prize winners, Schweitzer and Martin Luther King. And he goes and visits Schweitzer in Africa, and he becomes so enamored of him, and he writes a book about Schweitzer. Exman writes his own best-selling book about Schweitzer. There's a chapter about that in the book, and helps to raise money for Schweitzer. So those are there. Those letters written in French mostly. Interestingly, Schweitzer was from the Alsace, which is on the border of what is now France and Germany, on these tiny little inexpensive paper. The most inexpensive paper, almost like see-through paper. So yeah, I didn't want those to burn. So they are now in Middlebury College, is the answer to your question. Laurie Patton is the president there. She is a religious studies scholar. She's a Hinduism expert. I met her in Atlanta when I taught at Georgia State University, and we became friends. And Exman got an honorary degree from Middlebury in 1952. I'm not really sure exactly why he got on Middlebury's radar then, but he did. And so he has a connection there. Exman's granddaughter, Catherine Kess, went to Middlebury. And so there was a family connection with Middlebury. Laurie Patton's, the president of Middlebury, her expertise in religious studies is in religion and literature. She is a poet. She has translated the Bhagavad Gita, which is a poem, Hindu poem, into English. So she was very interested in Exman, and she was saying to me, as president of Middlebury, I haven't wanted to be push religion. That seemed like too selfish, So she's like, I'm just trying to be the president, but when I leave, I want there to be something here after me. So she's working on a religion and literature center that would have a spot for Exman and for his archive, in that center. But the archive is being cataloged, what do they call it? What they do with an archive, whatever. Processed. Thank you. It's being processed at Middlebury College. Yeah. And by the way, part of that archive is weird things like his Ouija board. You know, Bill Wilson of AA was really into talking with the spirits of the dead. He was really into it. And so he would have friends, when they came over to Bill Wilson's house, they would, I was going to say play with an Ouija board. They would do the Ouija board, like, oh, you know, ask the ghost, like, what, should I marry my girlfriend, you know, should I get a new job, whatever. So that's there, and like stuff Schweitzer signed, like, you know, from West Africa, that's there. One thing we haven't discussed is Exman took LSD in 1958 twice as part of the earliest experiments in the spiritual uses of LSD. And this started in the West Coast with the West Coasters, not surprising. Huxley, Gerald Hurd, Christopher Isherwood, and their LSD experiments kind of migrated east through Exman. And there was a group of about 12, 15 people who took LSD to try to see if that could prompt the God experience. And Exman did that twice. And in the archive was a reel-to-reel tape of his first experience, which I listened to. And then just a few months before I handed the book in, I texted or called Walter on the phone, the son-in-law, and I was like, we're missing the other tape. You know, we're missing his second experience, his second LSD experience. And I just think it's in your barn. Like, why haven't you found it? Like, where is it? Like, it was sent to him by someone. It should be there. So he like rooted around, and a few days later he called me back and said, I think I have it. I found 5 more reel-to-reel tapes. So I have both of his LSD experiences. Those are now going to Middlebury. On his first experience, he said he saw God, and on the second experience, he said he saw Lucifer. So he had a very, very bad trip the second time, and that convinced him that that was not a method for, you know, reaching God. It was a method for taking down the ego, which was like a veil in front of, you know, a thick veil to prevent you from seeing God, but it also allowed you to see other things, and it was a dangerous idea. So anyway, that was my long answer to that.
Yeah.
To further your question about huge wars in LSD, to what extent does Exman interact with esoteric or occult or Gnostic groups like Theosophists? And if he did, to what extent did he more modern expressions of innovation?
Yeah, okay, good. Okay, that's great. Because Rachel has been asking such great questions, but she's like missed some chapters, you know, like shame on her. Like, you know, this is my perennial problem with writing this story about him. There's like so many stories to tell that you just can't tell them all. But so he had a very close relationship with a woman named Marguerite Brough. There's over 1,000 letters by Marguerite Brough in the archive, more than by any other person. And she first came into Exman's life in the early 40s when she was writing a review of a book by a medium, you know, like a person that you could go to that would tell you about your past lives, that could connect you to dead people in your family that you wanted to talk to. And she was really intrigued by this, but intrigued by this in a kind of like investigatory way. And she wrote to Exman, like, somebody should write a book about this to see if it's real, you know? Because I'm going down to Virginia Beach to like check it out, and I'm going to write this review, but this really should be a book. Like, we should find out whether this is fake or whether this is real. And so she came into his life that way. He became really interested. He went to many mediums during his lifetime. He probably went at least a half a dozen times. He brought his kids to mediums. He brought his wife to mediums. Actually, maybe she didn't do it because she was kind of a Christian, more traditional Christian, and a little bit of a skeptic on paranormal. But she was very big on, you know, what the kind of laundry list of what we now think of as sort of new agey paranormal things like reincarnation. He published a book about UFOs. So he was like, you know, he was early on. That was pretty edgy for him to publish on UFOs, but he did. And so he was really interested in the paranormal. He was a believer / skeptic in the paranormal. Like, he believed that some of it was right, and that some of the stuff that was, some of it was happened, but some of the stuff that was said to be paranormal was just, faked up. Like, so that was his experience. But she would push him to publish more in this arena. And I really hope that when the archives become available at Middlebury, that someone will write a book about her, because Marguerite Bro, she was really, really interesting. She's a beautiful writer. Her letters to him are just, they're beautiful. Like, and they describe a kind of nature mysticism, but they also describe this incredibly lively mind. Like she published a novel that's still in print. She published nonfiction. She published a book about Indonesia, because she had traveled there. She grew up as she became a Christian missionary in her 20s with her husband in China. She published a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen ghostwritten books. I'm not sure how many. Lots of ghostwritten books. And she was really interested in paranormal things. And she was always pushing him to do more. And he was always like, yeah, I love that, but I can't do too many of those, because like the guys at Harper are not really into that, So I can publish ones that I'm really sure are going to make serious money. Like I can do those, but I love that one, but I can't do that one. So he was always kind of stuck more in the practical meeting the mission. Like he saw his job as a mission. Like he was a missionary for religion, not for Christianity or Jesus, but for religion. And he thought religion was going to solve the problem of the modern world. And so he was really big on that, but he also knew he had to make money for his company. And so a lot of their disagreements were how far could she push him on doing these paranormal things.
Yeah, Jonathan.
Just a question, picking up on the guys at Harper not being into it.
Yeah.
With the exception of Dorothy Day, it seems like almost everyone you mentioned in publishing were men. I could be wrong about that. But I'm just wondering, was that true? That the overwhelming majority of that which you published were by men? And do you think in some ways that limited the work he did, or was constrained in some ways that way?
Yeah. Yes. The answer to the first question is easiest. The answer would be yes. And he did publish overwhelmingly men. I mean, when he started, he was publishing mostly sermon books, or a lot of what he published, like in the 20s, in the very early 30s, were sermon books, and there weren't very many women preachers then, and so the genre didn't really fit. But the main thing, and also who were the most famous people in religion, right? Like he wasn't trying to invent who the most famous people were. He was trying to publish who the most famous people were, and the society was sexist and patriarchal, and those people were men. But also, have you seen Mad Men, the TV show? Anybody seen Mad Men?
Yes.
Like this was Mad Men. Mad Men is, like, it's a bunch of guys like doing their thing, and there's women who are involved, but the guys are just kind of networking, and you don't have to be that talented. You just have to know somebody, and then all of a sudden, you're a big shot ad person on Fifth Avenue or Madison Avenue or whatever it is. And so there was definitely a Mad Men quality to it, where it was a guy's business, and Exman would go to like the Century Club or one of those clubs in New York, and he'd have these 2 martini lunches with his friends. Actually, he didn't drink, so he didn't do that until he retired. But his version of whatever it was, 2 Coke lunches when they would have their 2 martini lunches, and they would chat, and then he'd like the guy, and he'd like, you should write a book for me, and that's kind of how it happened. Now he published women, and he had bestsellers by women. Dorothy Day, as you point out in an example, Marguerite Bro, with whom he worked, he also published under her name, and he published other women Catholics. I know 2 of the big other Catholic books he published were by women, but yeah, it was almost entirely he was publishing men. And then the second part of your question was, what was it that, like, what effect did that have, right? And so what effect that had is that the experience, this is the religion of experience, right? The experiences were the experiences of men, And so he's preaching, the gospel of experience, the religion of experience. He's telling people religion is essentially about experience, but the experiences that he is cataloging in his thousands of books, I call it his book of books, his anthology of books, in the way that the William James is an anthology of mystical experiences and conversion experiences. That his book of experiences is mostly autobiographies of men. Rosa Parks is not writing about the Montgomery story for him. Martin Luther King is writing the Montgomery story for him. So I think he perpetuates the idea that men are at the center of the story. And it's a little ironic because we do, like, the stereotype of women's religiosity is like, women's religiosity is more experiential, and maybe men are the ones who are coming up with the big ideas and writing the creeds and stuff like that. So in terms of gender, like, the tendency, at least in contemporary America, is to think, and even in Plato, is to think of experience as more, feminine, and thought as more masculine. So, credit to him for that. But yeah, he's publishing mostly the experiences of men.
I have a question about the category of mysticism. It kind of connected with this notion of experience as the most essential, the most pristine, the highest expression of genuine religiosity. It used to be in vogue, both in terms of general writings, also in terms of the study of religion once upon a time, perhaps during maybe when we are graduate students, kind of going, maybe, it depends on our age, maybe before that. It's kind of now receding into the background. At least that's my impression, that we don't talk too much about mysticism, about mystical experiences. Even the notion of experience being essential element of religion is kind of in the background there, maybe even not cool in kind of professional academic circles. What do you think about it? Do you think we miss something that perhaps we should reconsider this approach, and maybe we should open up, even like basic stuff like mysticism, courses of mysticism at universities like ours. So we don't have anything like that. I don't know about your program, if anybody is doing, but do you think the category is still useful, that we might want to redeem it, or there's a program? I was also thinking about, you mentioned Krishnamurti in passing, even like when I was very young, like during the 80s, I mean, he was still a thing. They still discussed and so on. What happened with the guy? I haven't heard anything about Krishnamurti for God knows how many. I mean, I don't know how connected it is, but I think it kind of fits into this kind of mold of experience being the essence. So, do you have any thoughts about this kind of?
Well, first of all, I love this question. Thank you for this question, because, in religious studies, experience got to have a moment, and mysticism got to have a moment with James, and then there was philosophers of religion were writing about mysticism, sort of following on James, and also European thinkers. And when was it when my colleague Steve Katz wrote his famous essay about, mysticism as historically, culturally conditioned, and mysticism is a product of history like anything else, and the conceit of the mystics that somehow they're stepping outside of history doesn't make any sense. In other words, like, nobody had a mystical experience of Jesus before the year 0. Like, that never occurred, right? Like, in other words, we have these experiences, and then, we translate them. Actually, that's not Katz's point. Like, the experiences are themselves products of our historical consciousness, right? So there isn't really any, in some ways, the strongest form of that argument, there isn't what we think of as a mystical experience, or like, it's just, insofar as we think of them as kind of outside of history, and these direct encounters with God that can't be explained through normal, means. So, and that was the 70s, and that kind of settled it in many ways for scholars, right? I mean, and James is not widely respected as a religious studies scholar. Like, we would include him if we're listing 10 definitions of religion. He's a very useful definition to in my textbook on the world's religions, I include William James's definition of, religion as, feelings and experiences. So yeah, I think this is where there's a gap between scholarship and popular writing about religion, right? And I think, to sort of jump to your question about courses, I think that scholars need to take more seriously popular culture, and like Krishnamurti still sells really well, like no scholars care about Krishnamurti. He's still in print. All his books are in print. Harper is minting money on these books still. That Exman. I mean, there's multiple millions of dollars in sales every year by books by Exman. These are middlebrow books. These are not highbrow books. Exman is reading mystics. He's reading scholars of mysticism, like Evelyn Underhill, and he's publishing them. He's publishing scholars of mysticism. But I agree. We think of that. The idea that religion is to be found in experience and in elite experiences that hardly anyone has is just totally against where religious studies is now, where we're interested in things like lived religion, ordinary religion. We don't want to create binaries and categories between like high religion and low religion and all that kind of stuff. And I think Exman knew that people in his own time were thirsty for this stuff. And I think it's true now. I think it's true now. I think certainly at the level that, I think a class in mysticism, no, I don't think it would sell. To go to the vulgar conversation now, but I think if you had a course, I don't know what I would call it. If I was going to teach a mysticism course, it might be something like, it might have the word supernatural in it, it might be called like weird religion or something like that, or weird spirituality. It wouldn't have a word religion in the title. It would be like weird spirituality or spiritual mysteries. That's what it might be, something like that. And then the books could very easily be about these uncanny experiences that people have had, like broader than mysticism, but experiences that are inexplicable, that basketball players have on the court. One of my former grad students is writing about this, like the kind of elevated flow experiences that people have on basketball courts. Like that's right up the alley of William James, and it's also right up the alley of students today. They're interested in that. And they've had experiences like that. They've had experiences when something weird has happened to them, and they feel caught out of what we would call the profane and drawn up into what we would call the sacred, And so, yeah, I think academics have fads too, and the fad of the last 40, 50 years is like Eliade. Eliade is of no interest, and because he's ahistorical, and mysticism is of no interest because it's ahistorical. But if you look at like scholars of Yoruba religion, they're very interested in Eliade now. They're not interested in the kind of bracketing that goes on in religious studies. So I know those fads change, and I think I'm one of those scholars who's gets criticized for being overly interested in popular books and things like that. But I think there's some. I don't know if I answer your question, but that's my effort. Thank you for that. I really enjoy that question. Hi.
Yeah, I was just mentioning for religion and paranormal.
Yeah.
Class that I teach.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, but the word religion I would take out if I'm your marketing advisor.
Students who take it would probably be okay with it. It's just the paranormal or the ghost class.
Yeah, exactly, the ghost class. Or like ghosts, whatever, something. Like 3 words where ghosts is one. Ghosts, zombies, maybe zombies. Yeah.
Well, great. We have Professor Prothero with us for our reception, and I hope you'll join us for something after, so we have a chance to talk. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Rachel.
So much.
I appreciate your